Welcome everybody, and it's lovely to see you all. And it's a delight to be, and an honor and a privilege to be invited to chair this meeting. And our topic is epistemic injustice and how that relates to the work that our Dementia Enquirers have been working on for at least the last 5 years. Actually, many of us have been working on it for a little bit longer, but certainly this particular project for the last 5 years. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm David Keay. My day job is Head of Applied Learning at the Mental Health Foundation. And I guess implicit in that is that the business of knowledge and understanding is part of my day job. And for me, as someone who has spent, oh good heavens, now I need to do the mental arithmetic, but over 40 years living with a series of psychiatric diagnoses, including a diagnosis of schizophrenia, I am used to what I say and what people with my diagnosis say not being taken seriously as perhaps what is said by the professionals around me. But I'm also hugely privileged in that for the last certainly 30 years, I've been working in organizations where that knowledge is taken very seriously. And in more recent times, but still working for a long time, I've had the extra privilege of working alongside a number of really lovely philosophers, one of whom is a friend of mine who I will introduce shortly, Anna, who've actually helped guide me through the process of understanding, the nature of knowledge and some of the theoretical underpinnings of this difference about how different people's knowledge is perceived and valued. And that is my very crude understanding of epistemic injustice. But we will have a much more comprehensive and comprehensible explanation of the concept from my panelists. So without further ado, I will introduce them. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they appear on my screen, so that may not be the appearance that they do with you. I'll start with George. George Rook has been. I still think of you as a pioneer, George. But please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm George. I live in North Shropshire. I was diagnosed with mixed dementia in 2014 and got quite soon after that involved with the DEEP organisation and innovations in dementia, and then got myself invited into the Dementia Pioneers project. Forgive the slipping between pioneers and inquirers, but basically the pioneers are the small group of people who actually sort of devised the whole thing. And then the Enquirers is the project under which there have been 25 research projects devised and led by people with dementia. So that's where I come from.
Lovely, thank you, George. And now Lubomira, who I've met much more recently through Anna, and it's lovely to see you again. Lubomira, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Lubomira. I'm a philosopher. I'm based here at the University of Kent in Canterbury, and I work on issues such as epistemic justice. And in essence, what I try to achieve as a philosopher is to make philosophy better understood and more present in everyday life, to make philosophy practical and practicable for all of us. Just like beautiful literature is not only for writers, philosophy is not only for philosophers, but for all of us.
That's lovely. Thank you, Lubomira. And I had the privilege and joy of actually meeting you face to face tomorrow, so which I'm looking forward to. Anna and I have worked together for a good while now. Anna, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yes, hello, I'm Anna Bergqvist. I work at Manchester Met, and I also have an affiliation with St Catherine's College in Oxford. I started out as a moral philosopher, really interested in voice and relationality, moral agency, and really the significance of the first person perspective on science. Then that brought me into more in the philosophy of science. And through the work that I've been doing with David, I'm very interested at the moment in interrogating the concept of expertise by experience, really in articulating the significance of theory in making progress with what is now policy, both in terms of mental health, but also in processes like shared decision making. And specifically, I'm interested in how we can work with these concepts in a truly relational way, such that shared decision making operates on a horizontal level as opposed to top down. So like Lubomira, I have an interest in knowledge production and where that sits.
Lovely, thank you. So what I'd like to do now is turn back to Lubomira and ask you to explain to those of us that are less familiar a little bit about epistemic injustice, what it is, and how we might understand it.
Yes, thank you very much, David. So, and thank you everyone for having me here. Having looked at what the Dementia Enquirers and pioneers are doing, this is one example, one absolutely fantastic example of what it is to bring about epistemic justice, right? So you may not know what the term means, but many of you have experience of doing it. I also think that many of you have direct first personal experience of epistemic injustice. And what that amounts to, in essence, is appreciating that inquiry, understanding, and knowledge are things that people do, and often they do together. As a result, all of these social expectations, social biases, social prejudices, assumptions as well, that we might encounter in everyday interactions, they would also be something that comes up unbeknown to us, not necessarily because we want to, precisely because we may not be aware that this is even possible in the way in which we engage as inquirers, as interlocutors with others. So to give you an example of the main kind of epistemic injustice, this is, for instance, the kind of so-called testimonial injustice, which is when people who are competent, capable, and speak truthfully are disregarded or ignored or misinterpreted. In essence, when through arbitrary barriers, truthful testimony is not taken up as evidence. And that very often happens as a result of some kind of identity prejudice because of the social category that is associated with this person. For instance, David mentioned having a psychiatric diagnosis. In some circumstances, having that diagnosis might lead to testimonial injustice when people express truthfully and quite intelligibly what they have to say.
Yeah.
So there's no uptake, and the injustice is that we do have the resources, we do have the criteria, which should have told us otherwise. In other words, when we have testimonial injustice, we should have known better, right? There is, however, another, even more insidious way of experiencing epistemic injustice, which has to do with the resources that we use. So it may be the case that even though people are as well-intentioned as they could possibly be, and they do not wish and they do not perpetrate testimonial injustice, there is still injustice going on as a result of the fact that we have not yet developed the conceptual resources that enable us to have a shared understanding of certain lived experiences. And this is where this is particularly important to have the kind of initiatives such as the Dementia Enquirers, because this is addressing the deeper kinds of injustice, more insidious kind of injustice, which is called hermeneutical, in order to kind of speak of the resources rather than the people that are affected by this injustice. This is the sort of thing that is addressed by precisely creating together the resources that would make the lived experiences first intelligible to the people who lived through those experiences, and second, would ensure that those who do not have first-hand experience can also understand them, can also integrate them into their picture of how the world actually is. What is their social world?
So that's a really helpful introduction, Lubomira. So what I'd like to do now, George, is I wonder if you could kind of respond and reflect to that from the perspective of, you know, wearing your pioneer and inquirer hat. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we who Dementia Enquirers and Pioneers have come up against is I was going to say sense of not being taken seriously, but actually the reality of not being taken seriously as researchers. There is a sort of perception, and it's across the medical world, it's across probably the academic world as well, and society more widely, that if you have a diagnosis of dementia, you have suddenly lost your capacity to do anything. And indeed, there are solicitors, for example, out there who will assume when you come to sign something that you cannot do it because you haven't got capacity, even though they haven't even asked you whether you have, you know, that sort of prejudice. So in terms of our research, we are in a sense breaking ground and finding that as we work with researchers, they are, I suppose, suddenly waking up to the fact that, oh, actually, yeah, we've got some good ideas. Our lived experience counts. We can actually help them frame their research better, so that they get results that are useful and meaningful to us. So and equally that we can, I mean, this applies to a project I'm involved in. We can make sure that the PPI label that is often used, you know, in most research applications, actually becomes proper co-production involvement and not just tokenism down the way. So I think, I mean, I only found out what epistemic or something injustice was from Wikipedia the other day. I said to David earlier, it is either conscious or unconscious bias that actually, as we with a disability, cognitive disability, hadn't got anything useful to be listened to. And another example from sort of my other experiences is, I've often heard it said when I've been talking to a professional, a doctor or a commissioner or something, about the experience that I've had as a person with dementia, I'll often get the response, well, you're just one person with dementia, why should we believe you? Quite apart from the fact that they may be unconsciously biased against me in the first place. And it's a sense of saying, well, actually, your lived experience doesn't matter because we don't know that anybody else has had your lived experience. Whereas in fact, each person's lived experience matters, as has been said earlier on. So I think that, yeah. David, back to you.
That's really helpful, George. Thank you. And I'm going to call on Anna now. Apologies. I'm having some strange errors with my system as well. So I tried to direct message Anna, and it came up as having gone to Philly. So,
that's okay. I'm very good at thinking on my feet. That's my job as a philosopher. So that's
excellent.
That's
good. Yeah, and I know you do it well. So Anna, I wonder if you could pull together those themes, and particularly with your interest in expertise by experience and shared decision making, and the power imbalances is the other thing that, I mean, George has touched on there in terms of thinking about bias, but the differences in power in that kind of decision making process. Could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think, so I think there are at least 2, 3, possibly 4 questions here. So one is, I guess, the moral significance of voice and lived experience in capturing the story, and so forth. But another one that I think really integrates what has been said so far is the theoretical challenges of co-creation in attaining a realistic and also informed view of the value of stakeholders as knowers in improving science. And by science here, I just mean theory building. Yeah, so I don't have a kind of overly medicalized conception of science itself. And I mean, as you touched upon already, George, a lot of PPI work that is now policy, certainly both in psychology and many other medical sciences, that PPI work often articulated in terms of co-production is typically limited to consultancy, where the research questions and very often also the expected outcomes are predefined, and then the role of the expert by experience, as opposed to the expert by training, is to provide response to a preset research agenda. Okay, so that's what I take to be a very bad model of co-production. So when we move away from, well, in order to improve PPI, both PPI and co-production, I think the harder question is to ask what is being produced here. So if it's a research grant that is being produced, you can see how various funding bodies would like to have precisely that setup. So you slot people into different roles, but that's partly because the product is itself predefined as a separate output, which is separate from the co-creative process. So I think in order to make progress, we need to start thinking about what the ways of attaining a co-created product, where the process of co-creative work with experts by experience is part and parcel of the outcome. Now, that's much harder to do, because once you move into that idea of co-creation, you need to precisely have that horizontal way of working, where you work as partners in a joint process, as opposed to occupying different professional roles. Yeah. And of course, with that comes, I guess, the whole risk of relatedness in research. I mean, typically research is understood as detached in an objective way from what you are interrogating. But when we are looking at interrogating co-creation itself, you can't necessarily have that separation between the researcher and the object of inquiry. So that raises a whole range of new questions, both in terms of scientific validation, but also in terms of research ethics and so forth. And so,
can I just, this instantly makes me think of one of the comments that came up last week when I was at a meeting with the Innovations in Dementia. And one of the really interesting things that this particular project has done is it's people living with dementia who've defined what the research questions are. And so often in the model that you describe, when PPI is that kind of add-in, the research question's been decided by either academics or even by the funding bodies or by the university, and then the methodology has been decided, and then you decide to involve people with lived experience. And I was really struck by part of the really impressive knowledge making capacity is actually asking the right questions in the first place before you even worry about the methodologies and the approaches. I mean, does that have a role in epistemic injustice, epistemic justice?
Yes, I would say so. And I guess so. I'm a philosopher, but I also work a lot with arts-based research and practice-based research, which sometimes contrasted with research by writing, as it were. But there are some interesting ways in which some of these processes that we find specifically in the arts and humanities, they tend to have that built-in creative process. So you can't actually think of your innovation before you start the co-creative process. And I think when it comes to more recent development in arts-led approaches to health and well-being and so forth, what we find there is quite an organic way of making progress, both in terms of product design, but also in co-creating service designs, environments, and so forth. So that, I guess, is something that slowly, but I do think steadily, funding bodies are recognized as an important way of capturing assets that there are in terms of improving models. The much harder thing to crack here, and this goes back to epistemic injustice in terms of co-production. Usually, the academic knowledge is produced within academia, and it sits very much with academia. So I guess the harder question is one of looking at ways of evaluating these types of co-creative processes and also co-created proposed solutions. And I think moving forward, that's the area of research that is perhaps the most underdeveloped across the board, both in terms of genuine co-creation in reimagining PPI work, but I imagine also within dementia work.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. I think we might come back to evaluation. What I'd like to do now is go back to George. Firstly, I think he had a kind of response to that, but also whether you are or aren't covering this, maybe George, you could think about how that relates to your experience of broader research in dementia and the challenges that we've faced in that, if that makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, I mean, the comment I was just going to make was to do with the evaluation thing. And yeah, we could do, it's a sort of chicken and egg situation. The research community could do with some evidence that we can do this, and therefore the evidence would come from the evaluation project of some of our Dementia Enquirer research, for example, or for that matter, anything that we're involved in now, where we've been genuinely from the beginning. What was the other thing you asked me about?
Yeah, sorry, George. I mean, I was thinking when Anna was talking about arts-based research, a lot of the research in dementia is very biochemically orientated, and there's a kind of presumption that you need to be an expert in that to be involved, and that kind of instantly marginalizes people with lived experience of dementia.
Right. So So even for biochemical type research, you still need, I believe, to involve people with dementia at the co-design process stage, as Anne put it, at the beginning, looking forwards, so that you can make sure that, for example, people with dementia get the right support, get the right environment for doing whatever is going to be done to them, or whatever, and equally, I mean, I think it's pretty important to say that there are probably some biochemical research projects out there that might not be things that we would necessarily see as first line importance for research. I mean, David just referred to it, by implication, I suppose, research into the social aspects of living with dementia. And indeed, our 25 Dementia Enquirer projects, we're all concerned with the living with dementia issues, and they can lead to real change. Now, we need a biochemical thing in case we can ever come up with a cure or a prevention or whatever, but we also need to address, that near enough 1 million people in the UK who are living with dementia and who are living their lives. And I think it's a sign of, again, epistemic injustice that actually we are pretty much ignored during our lives, certainly by the medical world, post-diagnosis. And I think that there is just, I don't know what it is behind, underlying the ignoring us, whether it's just because doctors can't see how to cure it, therefore they don't have anything to do with it, or what. Anyway.
Okay, thank you, George. One, I'd like to kind of throw in a slightly curveball one. I'd like to ask either Philly or Rachel, what prompted them to think of this as a topic for a discussion? Because I think it's really interesting, and we think it's really interesting, but it's not the first thing you'd think of for a seminar title. I wonder if either of you would give us a sense of what prompted you to think of this as something to talk about.
Should I have a go, Philly? I think you came up with the idea, to be honest, David. However,
did I really? Oh,
but I think we have talked about the this is a project that is quite contained within Innovations in Dementia. It's a project that has emerged from the work that we do alongside people with dementia. It comes from that world of action. And we're having these conversations all the time with people with dementia about injustices and unconscious bias, but we don't put them in a framework. We haven't got the framework in which we have these discussions. And I think when we've had those conversations with you and you've brought this world to us that we're not particularly knowledgeable about, it kind of chimes, and it makes us it puts our work in the context of broader philosophy and broader research, and gives us some backup, I guess, to our thinking and the way that we work. So it's always been incredibly interesting to have had these conversations with you about epistemic injustice, but I think it chimes really strongly with where our starting point and what we have been thinking, and I guess gives us more confidence to keep doing this work.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pop back to Lubomira now, because as soon as I saw some of the topics that you were thinking about, I just instantly thought of this as the kind of thing that you and this group should be talking about. So how have you found it so far?
Absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much for these very valuable insights. I just would like to highlight three things. The first is that genuinely there is more work to be done than just identifying biases, right? So it is important to do this kind of inquiry, which creates knowledge, which creates conceptual resources. And importantly, unlike the biomedical sciences, philosophy does have the methodologies to involve people who do not have background in philosophy and to treat them immediately as co-creators. This is actually the very foundational methodology of philosophy. It is called Socratic dialogue, right? This is what people did. And the beginning of it is very simple. The so-called expert by training is the one who does not come with knowledge. This is the one who absolutely admits ignorance. So Socrates is the one who says, I know that I know nothing, right? So this is the expert by training. They do not know. All that they do is that they provide this conceptual framework in which questions can be asked, questions can be followed up on, and the lead comes through people who have that first personal experience. And very importantly, in philosophy, we might not always have been good at following up on this, but at least there is one fundamental kind of knowledge, which is called knowledge by acquaintance. This is exactly the sort of knowledge that is importantly direct. You have to have the lived experience, what it is like to be a person with dementia, right? And it doesn't have to be that this experience speaks to the experiences of anybody else, but you have that first personal experience of that specific thing, that specific condition, and this is important and this is valuable. And it does not become any less valuable because it might not be shared by others. This is where the philosophical aspect of the dialogue can be helpful and supportive, not merely to validate, but also to help enrich and develop those resources. But again, this is from the perspective of not imposing resources, but assisting creators to develop their own resources. That's the perspective.
Thank you, Lubomira. And I'd just like to remind people that if they have any questions, points, or issues anyone wants to raise, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand. I can't see all screens at once, so apologies if I miss hands, but I've also got Philly and one of the 300 Rachels scanning the screen as well. So hopefully we'll pick you up. So please do. We're here to kind of take any points and any discussions from anyone. I noticed, for example, lurking somewhere in the background is Toby Williamson, who is one of the people responsible for dragging me into this field in the first place many years ago, and who's been involved in this project for probably longer than I have. But there are, so please, anyone who feels they would like to ask a question, make a point, contribute to the discussion, it's time for all of us to contribute, and definitely in the spirit of epistemic inclusion, if there is such a thing. Oh, there's Philly. There's a hand up with Philly.
This is fascinating and really fascinating, that my head hurts a bit. I'm sure everybody's head is hurting a bit. Just the point I wanted to make is that this discussion about injustice really links to what is still happening in the wider world, not just in the world of research. And there will be people here today and others who have experienced the ire of some so-called expert professionals in the sphere, in the field, who basically, in a nutshell, sort of say, if you can do anything at all, you can't, by definition, have a diagnosis of dementia, which is quite a kind of circular thing, really, because you can't win on that one. If you want to reply and respond and argue, then by definition you can't have dementia, so your point won't be valid. And those people are not willing to learn and maybe change their own view of what dementia is or what the parameters of dementia are. They simply start from what they have learned or been taught as professional experts and won't budge from that, even in the light of very compelling lived experience. So I think the result of that is that not only do we risk losing very valuable evidence, the evidence of the lived experience we're talking about, but we also risk, and we've seen how this happens, losing the participation of people with dementia who can and really want to contribute, because they are beaten down by that kind of that view and those attacks.
I think that's a really helpful observation, Philly, and I think that kind of that tie-in between knowledge as an academic pursuit and knowledge is just part of the way we all live and the way we make individual decisions, we make community decisions, we make political decisions. I mean, we're always talking about evidence-based practice and evidence-based policy, but if the evidence is partial in the first instance, or biased, or just absent because the people who should be generating it aren't taken seriously as knowledge generators, then decision making is going to be poorer for it, and sometimes just plain wrong. And I think that kind of pulls me back to Anna's space of shared decision making. And sometimes I'll ask Anna to talk a little bit to this, but sometimes we talk about shared decision making in a very kind of transactional way. So it's a clinician and a patient, but we can also talk about shared decision making in a community, in a country, and so on. And so, Anna, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, from what's been said so far.
Yeah, that was actually what motivated the hand that I had up, and that was prompted by George's comment about living with dementia. Very often, I think, when we and I'm thinking here specifically of shared decision making as a dialogue, but where the dialogue isn't necessarily a transaction. But what we often lose track of is what the point of that dialogue was supposed to be, and that was a matter of determining quality of life from the point of view of the person whose life is concerned. That's very difficult, especially when we have a kind of an objectified conception of well-being. You can just take any well-being scale that you like, where the concept of well-being is understood independently from the quality of life of the person in question. So I think part of the difficulty here is that the different concepts of well-being here, so I think if we really want to effect some change, and after all, shared decision is the gold standard. It's just that people aren't very good at executing it, partly because it requires that you engage with the person's life in question. So that takes us straight back to George's point. In order to find out what is to be done, you first of all need to find out what living with dementia is from that person's point of view, and that can be very difficult. And I guess that also takes us to a relational aspect of any person's individual life. Part of the complication here is that the person's individuality is always in relation with others, and that, in the case of dementia, adds a further complication, as we all know. But I do think that from a, as it were, medical point of view, given that shared decision making is now policy to unpack theoretically what is meant by quality of life. Once we take that seriously, is a way of saying, well, this should already be policy. So it's more, I think, the challenges of educating professionals in having these conversations. And that's not usually done because professionals very often have a conception of well-being which is detached from this much harder philosophical question of quality of life from the person's point of view.
That's really helpful, Anna. I noticed, I think Mac had his hand up, but again, my labeling is producing a few strange results. So, Mac, did you have your hand up? You did. Okay. Mac, the floor is yours. I think you're muted. Oh, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. I do apologize. My connection is a bit weak, so I'm hearing every other word. So I don't know whether you can hear me or not. But from listening to all this, you know, I've said this before, I think it's basic education that's needed, nothing else. Because the word dementia, I'm sorry to say, it's not even understood by the professionals, let alone the normal public. Because the minute you mention the fact that you have diagnosis of dementia, you're automatically assumed incapable of doing anything. And so rightly, like Steve has just written in the chat box, we are ignored. I have been living with the condition since 2010. And let me tell you, I've just come back from a 5-week holiday, and 99% of people that I met did not know that I've got diagnosis of dementia. And would you believe that not a single person picked up anything that actually showed that I've got some sort of disability? And I took full advantage of that, and I bloody enjoyed myself, you know? And that dementia wasn't there with me at all. And the biggest thing that I believe happens is the actually thought of having a disease that is not curable has more effect on you than the disease itself. So I think that not just like normal people, professionals also need to be educated on this, and they need to take notice, because what we are going to say, they are not going to find in the textbooks, because every single person is a volume, and they need to listen and look and listen. And that's all that's needed. I think, because, you know, you've got origins, I've made notes of this, you've got belief, you've got empowering people, and you've also got objectives and the knowledge, and all these things combined together make this study possible. And the reason why people study is, number one is to gain knowledge. Number two is help and improve and maybe find a cure for whatever it is, or even try and prevent it in the future. And the best way to do it is learning from people with the condition. Thank you for listening.
That's really helpful, Mac. Thank you very much. And there were a lot of nods and supportive notes in the chat as well. So I think that chimes with a few people, including, and I don't know if you want to follow this up with all of us, but I noticed Laura Stewart, who I'm guessing comes from a professional background, given your comment. Did you want to contribute? Oh, hang on.
We can't hear you, Laura, I don't think. No, you're not on mute, but we can't hear you. I think George was waving his hand, David, whilst Laura... Okay,
let's go to George, and we'll come back to Laura if we can.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on something raised by a couple of people. It takes time to get to know people, whether you have dementia or not, and to make a decision, especially an important decision, and to share that decision with your clinician or whoever takes time that they will always say they haven't got. But actually, you need that because there are so many elements to a person's life. Sorry about my dog. Equally, the other thing I and a lot of people with dementia have been told you don't look like you've got dementia or you don't sound like you've got dementia, because we can summon up our best facilities, let's say faculties, on a given day. That doesn't mean that our lived experience of those other days or other times when we're not actually at all in a good place, or when we're having particular symptoms, that those don't get seen. So again, it's a sort of injustice based on not getting to know the person, just making assumptions, as I think other people have said.
Thank you, George. And I think one of the things you've highlighted again is one of the things that has come out from my observations of this project and other work is that generating knowledge is hard work. And sometimes it is undoubtedly harder work for some groups and some individuals than others. And living with dementia and living with the prejudices and biases that come alongside that make the whole business of generating knowledge much more difficult than if you are in the role like I am, where you're actually being paid to do it. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed has worked really well in the Dementia Enquirers is the support that others have given to enable people with dementia to develop knowledge. And I think that's something that is just good for all of us. I've learned a huge amount, walking alongside you, in exactly the same way that I've learned a huge amount walking alongside Anna, and I expect to with Lubomira. I'm going to go back to Laura again, just in case. Do you have an external mic or a headset or anything? Because sometimes that's why I can't hear you.
I've tweaked some settings. Can you hear me now?
Oh, perfect. Lovely. Thank you, Laura.
Wonderful stuff. Technology, hey? I was just about to say I'm a pharmacist by training, and work predominantly with people with dementia, and I see it far too often, exactly what Masood said. As soon as people see, I call it the label, as soon as people see the label, they have all these preconceived ideas. And I had a trainee once tell me, I work in secondary care psychiatry services, but I had a trainee who'd come from the acute sector, so someone had been admitted somewhere like a medical assessment unit over a weekend, and with regard to medicines for her physical health, it was insulin, in fact. The pharmacist had been asked to clarify her dose that she'd been taking because they couldn't get access to all the relevant information. And so the pharmacist duly went and asked the patient, what dose of insulin do you use? And explained to her exactly what she took and how she took it, and knew everything about it. And when she fed this back to the rest of the care team, well, no, we can't rely on that because she's got dementia. And it is this label. People have these ideas and stop being curious and stop really seeing what's in front of them. And so it's too much. And it's one of the things that I try and encourage colleagues to not do. Be a bit more aware of your biases and your prejudices around the diagnosis, and don't judge people on their label, and really, go on what you see in front of you, is what I would say.
Thank you, Laura. That's really helpful. Mac, I think I saw your card again.
Yeah, just a reply to Laura there. I picked up things that have actually happened to me. Like one professional, for instance, I had my cataracts removed. And when I went there, I told them that I'm living with the diagnosis of dementia. And all of a sudden, their attitude all changed. Can you hear me all right? Are you okay? Do you speak the language? And all the rest of it. And where are you from? And I said, I'm from Stoke-on-Trent. How about you? And, the point that I'm trying to make is that these little things, they make a difference to us. And I feel degraded One person said to me, would you like, can you write something for me? And I wrote something and I gave it to him. I said, here you are, you said write something and I've written something. Now, don't underestimate us. I know there's something wrong up there, but we're not loopy. And I believe that the word dementia itself has a big role to play in it, because it's so closely linked with demented, people automatically take the wrong end and then automatically assume. I have known people to assume that people with dementia or diagnosis is not incapable, not just that, he can't do anything, but it's dangerous because they do not understand what this disease is and how it affects a person differently. The uniqueness of that person is not understood by the professionals. That's what I think anyway.
I'd agree with that actually, Mac. And the other thing I would add to that, they don't understand because they think they know. They don't accept that that might be wrong or flawed, and that I think is the bigger problem. They're sort of blinkered to it.
Thank you very much. I'm really conscious of time now, folks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring us to a little bit of a close. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to reflect in the briefest possible way. So if you could give us kind of 30 seconds to 45 seconds on what you'd like to see change, and then I should be able to bring us to a graceful conclusion just before 2 o'clock. So I'll start with Anna.
Yes, thank you very much. I think there are two areas of actually mental health research that I think could be useful here. One is, I guess, recovery-based models that are based on quality of life as opposed to symptoms reduction. I think that would be a very useful way of rethinking dementia, especially when the idea of cure will look very different. So that's my first stab. The second one I think would be well, this goes back to the conversations we just had now in relation to uptake and actually listening to what is in front of you. One way in which that plays out, moving back to our theme of today, is precisely that of hearing the other, but doing so in a relational way whereby you accept that I, as a listener, may fail to listen. Yes, so there is a real risk on behalf of any practitioner to actually engage seriously in that process. And so, yeah, I'll shut up there.
That's really helpful, Anna. And I think, yeah, I would like to give a special round of applause to Laura as a professional who took the risk of coming out and talking about some of the challenges from her side. So thank you. Lubomira, 30 to 45 seconds on
Yes.
summary.
So what I would like to change, I would like to see philosophy being employed as the neutral ground on which people with different kinds of experiences and expertise can meet without those heavy assumptions and without thinking that we need to evaluate something along the lines of this kind of research or the other kind of research. And the second thing that I take away is something that Laura said beautifully. They don't understand because they think they know, right? This kind of assumption of knowledge, this is what I would like to change. And this is why I believe that we philosophers can contribute something to the endeavor of bringing more epistemic justice in removing the little things that ultimately life is made of. Those nasty little things, those degrading little things that come from people who believe they know, but they understand very little. So these are the two things I have to say.
That's absolutely perfect. And I will give, as I think is only appropriate, the final commentary word to George.
Thank you. 3 things. Firstly, we need to get everything we're talking about here out there. I mean, we just need more and more of this to get to researchers and medics and all the rest. We need, I think there should be more training provided in any professional sphere for about unconscious bias, or if you want to give it its full name, epistemic injustice, because it probably is unconscious, or it's conscious but not in a sense deliberate, quite a lot of it. And thirdly, why could we not require all research submissions to demonstrate that there has been co-production with people living with dementia, and for that matter carers, before that initial submission? Because it usually just says, we will do PPI and that's it. So if it was required before submission of the initial idea, then it would improve things.
That's lovely. You've taken us perfectly to 2 o'clock. I'm very conscious of time, and I see a lot of people have to leave here and now. So I will bring us to a close. Huge thanks to Philly and Rachel for sorting this out. A big sorry to Steve, whose card just went off after I called the meeting to a close. But Steve, thank you for joining us. It's lovely to see you and other folk around. I think if speakers can hang around a little bit afterwards for a debrief, that would be great. But for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope this has been a helpful and useful discussion. Thank you, everybody.